Hey everyone, imagine this. You wake up in the darkness of a winter morning. Your breath comes out in thick white clouds that hang in the air before your face. You blink your eyes open, and as your vision adjusts to the dim gray light filtering through the cracks in the shutters, you notice something strange. Something terrifying, really. The inside of your home is covered in ice. Not just a little frost on the windows. No, actual ice has formed on the walls inside your house. Icicles hang from the ceiling beams above your head. The water in the bucket beside your bed has frozen completely solid. And the blanket covering you, the one thin wool blanket that's supposed to keep you alive through the night, is stiff with frost from your own frozen breath. This isn't some nightmare. This isn't an exaggeration or a story meant to frighten you. This was the actual reality that millions of medieval people woke up to every single winter morning for hundreds and hundreds of years. Think about that for a moment. Really let it sink into your mind. The inside of their homes, the places where they were supposed to find shelter and safety, were barely warmer than the frozen landscape outside. Sometimes they weren't warmer at all. We live in a world today where we take heat for granted. When we feel even slightly cold, we walk over to a wall, turn a dial, or press a button, and within minutes, warm air floods through our homes. We have thermostats that keep our houses at exactly the temperature we want, day and night, without us having to do anything at all. We have electric heaters, forced air furnaces, radiators, heated blankets, and a dozen other ways to stay warm. We've become so comfortable, so accustomed to being warm whenever we want, that we can barely imagine what life was like before all of this existed. But for medieval people, winter wasn't just an inconvenience. It wasn't just a season where you had to wear a coat when you went outside. Winter was a genuine, terrifying threat to survival. It was a season that killed. It killed children in their sleep. It killed elderly people who simply couldn't generate enough body heat to survive. It killed healthy adults who made one wrong decision, who let their fire go out for just a few hours, who didn't prepare quite enough firewood, who got caught outside in a blizzard. The statistics are genuinely horrifying when you look at them. Historians estimate that in particularly harsh winters, somewhere between 10 and 30% of the population in some medieval villages simply didn't survive until spring. Think about that. Imagine if 3 out of every 10 people in your neighborhood just died every winter. That was the reality. Winter was a mass death event that happened every single year, as predictable as the sunrise, and there was almost nothing anyone could do to stop it. And here's the thing that makes it even worse. It wasn't a quick death. Freezing to death is a slow, agonizing process. Your body fights desperately to keep your vital organs warm. It shuts down blood flow to your fingers, your toes, your nose, your ears. These extremities turn white, then blue, then black as the tissue dies from lack of blood. You start shivering uncontrollably as your muscles try to generate heat. But eventually, even the shivering stops. You become confused, disoriented. You might even start to feel warm, which is one of the cruel tricks that hypothermia plays on the dying brain. People in the final stages of freezing to death have been known to tear off their clothes because they suddenly feel hot. And then, finally, your heart just stops beating. Medieval people knew all of this. They watched it happen to their neighbors, their friends, their family members. They lived with the constant fear that this winter might be the one that killed them. And yet, somehow, many of them survived. They found ways, desperate and often dangerous ways, to make it through those brutal months when the temperature dropped below freezing and stayed there for weeks or months at a time. The question we're going to explore tonight is simple but profound. How did they do it? How did medieval people survive winter without any of the heating technology that we consider absolutely essential today? What methods did they use? What sacrifices did they make? And perhaps most importantly, how many of them didn't survive despite their best efforts? I want to be very clear about something from the start. This isn't going to be a cozy story about people gathered around a warm fireplace, sipping hot drinks and telling stories while snow falls gently outside. That's a fantasy, a romanticized version of medieval winter that has almost nothing to do with historical reality. The truth is so much darker, so much more desperate, and so much more tragic than anything we see in movies or read in books. We're going to talk about families who brought livestock into their homes and slept next to cows and pigs just to share their body heat. We're going to talk about houses filled with toxic smoke 24 hours a day because there was no other way to stay warm. We're going to talk about children who went to bed wearing every piece of clothing they owned and still froze to death before morning. We're going to talk about people who burned their furniture, their doors, even the wooden beams holding up their roofs, because they ran out of firewood and had no other choice. This is the reality of medieval winter. And if you're sitting there right now in your heated home, maybe wrapped in a warm blanket, maybe with a hot drink nearby, I want you to take just a moment to be grateful for it. Because what you're about to hear is the story of millions of people who would have given anything, absolutely anything, for the comfort and warmth that you have access to every single day without even thinking about it. Most medieval people didn't survive winter. They endured it. They suffered through it. They watched people they loved die from it. And every spring that they lived to see was a small miracle, a victory against odds that we can barely comprehend today. So let's begin this journey into the frozen nightmare of medieval winter. Let's understand what it really meant to face the cold in an age before heating technology, before modern medicine, before any of the safety nets and comforts that we rely on today. Because their story is one of human resilience in the face of almost unimaginable hardship. And it's a story that deserves to be told. Now let's talk about fire, because fire was the only defense that medieval people had against the killing cold of winter. But here's what you need to understand right from the start. Medieval heating wasn't like anything we know today. It wasn't reliable. It wasn't safe. It wasn't even particularly effective most of the time. The fire that was supposed to keep you alive could just as easily kill you in half a dozen different ways. Picture a typical medieval peasant home. We're not talking about a castle here. We're talking about the houses where the vast majority of people actually lived. These were small structures, usually just one room. Sometimes two if the family was relatively prosperous. The walls were made of wattle and daub, which is basically sticks woven together and covered with mud and straw. The roof was thatched, made from dried reeds or straw. And right in the middle of this single room was an open fire pit. That's right, not a fireplace built into a wall, not a stove, just a pit dug into the dirt floor with a fire burning in it. And that fire was expected to heat the entire space, cook all the food, provide all the light, and keep an entire family alive through months of freezing temperatures. The smoke from this fire had nowhere to go except up, hopefully finding its way out through a hole in the roof. But that hole had to be small, because you didn't want all your heat escaping. So the smoke would fill the room, hanging in thick clouds at head level, making your eyes water and your lungs burn with every breath. Living in a medieval house in winter was like living in a smokehouse. That's not an exaggeration. The air inside was thick with smoke constantly, 24 hours a day, for months at a time. You couldn't escape it. You breathed it in while you ate, while you worked, while you tried to sleep. Children grew up never knowing what clean air felt like. Their lungs were coated with soot from the day they were born. Respiratory diseases were absolutely rampant. Chronic coughs, lung infections, what we would recognize today as emphysema and lung cancer. These were just normal parts of life. And here's something that most people don't realize. Carbon monoxide poisoning killed medieval families all the time. They had no idea what carbon monoxide was. They couldn't see it, couldn't smell it, couldn't taste it. All they knew was that sometimes families would go to sleep around their fire and simply never wake up. The village would find them in the morning, all dead, with no visible injuries, no signs of violence, just gone. They thought it was demons or evil spirits or God's punishment for sin. They had no concept that the fire they relied on for survival was producing an invisible poison that was suffocating them in their sleep. But even if the smoke and carbon monoxide didn't kill you, there were so many other ways that fire could go wrong. The most obvious one was that the fire might spread. Remember, these houses were made of straw, dried reeds, and wood. They were basically kindling. All it took was one spark landing on the thatched roof, and the entire house would go up in flames in minutes. Whole villages burned down regularly because one fire got out of control and spread from house to house. And in winter, when everything was sealed up tight to keep the cold out, people often couldn't escape in time. They burned to death, trapped in their own homes. Even if the fire stayed contained, even if it didn't spread to the house itself, there was still the constant danger of burns. Children playing too close to the fire pit would trip and fall in. Women cooking would catch their long skirts on fire. Men would roll over in their sleep and end up with their blankets in the flames. Severe burns in the medieval period were essentially a death sentence. There were no burn units, no skin grafts, no antibiotics to prevent infection. If you got badly burned, you would either die from the burns themselves or more likely from the infections that set in afterward. But let's say you managed to avoid all of these dangers. Let's say the smoke didn't poison you, the fire didn't spread, nobody got burned. You still had another massive problem to deal with. The fire would go out, and when it went out, especially in the middle of the night, the temperature inside your house would plummet so fast it was terrifying. See, that open fire pit in the middle of the room provided heat, but not very much heat, and not for very long. The warmth didn't circulate efficiently. The area right next to the fire might be tolerably warm, might even be hot, but just a few feet away, you'd be freezing. And God help you if you were in a corner of the room, because the heat simply didn't reach there at all. Medieval houses had no insulation. The walls were full of gaps and cracks. The cold air from outside seeped in constantly, and the warm air from the fire escaped just as quickly. This meant that keeping the fire burning was absolutely critical, but it was also incredibly difficult. Someone had to be awake and tending the fire at all times. You had to keep feeding it wood, keep stirring it, keep making sure it didn't go out. This was usually the job of the women and children of the household. They would take turns throughout the night, staying awake in shifts to keep the family alive. But people are human. People get tired. People fall asleep when they're supposed to be watching the fire. And when that happened, when the fire burned down to just embers and then went cold, disaster struck fast. Within an hour of the fire going out, the inside of the house would be just as cold as the outside. Within 2 hours, water would start freezing. By morning, people would wake up with frostbite, or they wouldn't wake up at all. Starting a fire again wasn't as simple as flicking a lighter. Medieval people had to use flint and steel, striking them together over and over until they got a spark to catch on some dried tinder. In good conditions, this might take a few minutes. In winter, with cold hands that weren't working properly, in the dark, often with damp wood, it could take an hour or more. And every minute that passed was a minute where everyone in the house was at risk of freezing to death. Some families would keep coals burning in clay pots, covered with ashes to preserve them overnight. They could use these coals to restart their main fire in the morning. But coals could go out too. And God help you if your coals died and you couldn't get your flint and steel to work. Your only option then was to go to a neighbor's house and beg for some burning embers to take home. This meant going outside, in the freezing cold, often in the dark, trudging through snow, just to get fire. And if all your neighbors' fires had gone out too, which happened in the coldest weather, an entire village could be in desperate trouble. The absolute terror of losing your fire in the middle of winter is something we simply cannot comprehend today. Imagine being responsible for keeping your entire family alive, and the only thing standing between them and death is your ability to keep this fire burning. The pressure must have been absolutely crushing. One mistake, one moment of falling asleep when you should have been awake, and everyone you loved could die. And it happened. It happened all the time. There are historical records of entire families found frozen together in their homes, clustered around cold fire pits, having died sometime in the night after their fire went out. The children would be in the middle, with the parents wrapped around them, trying to use their own bodies to keep their babies warm. But without fire, without heat, body warmth alone wasn't enough. Not in the brutal cold of a medieval winter. And then there was the problem of firewood itself. You needed so much of it. A single family could easily burn through a whole tree's worth of wood in just a week during the coldest months. That's a lot of wood, which meant someone had to cut it, haul it, split it, stack it, and store it. This was backbreaking work that took months of preparation before winter even arrived. Poor families often couldn't gather enough wood to last the whole winter. They would run out sometime in January or February, with weeks or months of cold weather still ahead. What did they do then? They burned anything they could find. Furniture, tools, parts of their house itself. There are records of people tearing boards off their walls to burn for heat, which of course made their houses even colder because now there were even more gaps letting in the wind. Desperate people would venture out into winter storms to search for fallen branches or dead trees. Many of them got lost in blizzards and froze to death. Others made it home with their precious bundles of wood, only to realize it was damp and wouldn't burn properly. filling their houses with even more smoke than usual while providing almost no heat. The wealthy had it slightly better, but not by as much as you might think. Yes, they had servants to gather wood and tend fires. Yes, they had more wood stockpiled. But their houses were massive, drafty stone buildings that were nearly impossible to heat effectively. A fire in a great hall might warm the area immediately around it, but the rest of that huge space would be absolutely frigid. Even kings and queens shivered in their castles. Some wealthier homes did eventually develop primitive chimneys, which helped with the smoke problem. But chimneys brought their own issues. Birds would build nests in them during summer, blocking them up. Rain and snow would come down the chimney, putting out fires. And chimney fires, where the buildup of creosote inside the chimney would ignite, were terrifying events that could burn down even a stone building. The bottom line is this: medieval heating methods were primitive, dangerous, and often ineffective. Fire was the only option they had, but it was an option that came with a huge cost. The smoke destroyed their lungs. The carbon monoxide poisoned them. The fires burned them and their homes. The constant work of keeping the fire alive exhausted them. And despite all of this, despite all the effort and danger and sacrifice, people still froze to death regularly because the heat just wasn't enough to keep them safe. When we turn on our thermostats today, we're using technology that medieval people would have thought was literal magic. The ability to make your house warm without fire, without smoke, without constant work, without danger. It's a miracle that we've forgotten is a miracle because it's so normal for us. But medieval people would have given anything for it. If you were a medieval person trying to survive winter, your bed wasn't just a place to sleep. It was a survival pod, a fortress against the cold, the only place where you had any real hope of staying warm enough to live through the night. And I need you to understand something right from the start. Medieval beds looked nothing like the beds we sleep in today. They were completely different, and that difference was all about one thing: survival. Let's start with the basic structure. A medieval bed, for anyone who could afford one at all, was a massive piece of furniture. We're talking about something that might take up a quarter or even a third of the entire room. It was raised up off the ground because the floor was the coldest part of the house. Cold air sinks, and in a medieval house with dirt floors, that cold would seep up from the ground itself. Sleeping on the floor in winter was basically a death sentence. You had to get up off that freezing ground if you wanted to survive. The bed itself was built like a room within a room. It had 4 tall posts, one at each corner, reaching almost to the ceiling. And strung between these posts were heavy curtains, thick woolen curtains that could be pulled completely closed on all 4 sides. When those curtains were closed, you were essentially in a small enclosed space, trapped in there with all your body heat. This was the entire point. The curtains created a tiny area that could be heated by nothing more than the warmth of human bodies sleeping inside. Think about what this means. You couldn't see out. You couldn't look around your room at night. You were sealed into this dark, enclosed space, breathing recycled air that got staler and staler as the night went on. It must have felt like being in a coffin, honestly. But it was better than freezing to death, so that's what people did. And you weren't alone in there. Nobody slept alone in medieval times. Not in winter. The bed was shared by the entire family. Mother, father, children, sometimes grandparents too, all crammed into one bed together. The children would be in the middle, where it was warmest, with the adults on the outside. Bodies pressed against bodies, sharing heat, because shared body heat was the only heat you had once you closed those curtains. For poor families who couldn't afford a bed with posts and curtains, they had to make do with other solutions. Some hung blankets from the ceiling beams, creating a makeshift tent over their sleeping area. Others slept in alcoves built into the walls, tiny spaces barely big enough to fit a person, because smaller spaces were easier to keep warm. And many, probably most, simply slept together on the floor, huddled under every scrap of fabric they owned, praying they'd wake up in the morning. The mattress itself was a bag stuffed with straw, not a comfortable feather mattress. Just straw, dried grass, sometimes leaves or heather if you lived near moors. This provided some insulation from the bed frame, but not much. The straw would compact down over time, becoming less and less effective. It would get damp from condensation, from body sweat, and damp straw doesn't insulate at all. You'd have to replace it periodically, which meant dragging out all the old, rotting, probably flea-infested straw and stuffing in fresh straw. And where were you supposed to get fresh straw in the middle of winter when everything was frozen? You couldn't, so you suffered with what you had. The blankets were wool. Wool was the only fabric that could keep you warm when it got wet, and everything got wet in a medieval house. The condensation, the humidity from cooking and breathing, from the animals that were often kept inside, it all made everything damp. Wool was heavy, scratchy, and it smelled terrible, but it worked better than anything else available. But here's the thing. Even with all of this, even sealed inside your curtained bed, buried under wool blankets, pressed against your family members for warmth, you were still cold. Your breath would freeze in the air inside those curtains. You'd wake up and see frost on the inside of the fabric. The curtains themselves would be stiff with ice by morning. Your hair and beard, if you had one, would have icicles frozen into it from your breath. And then there was the desperate measure that people took to add just a little more warmth to their beds. They would heat stones or bricks in the fire, wrap them in cloth, and bring them into bed. These heated stones could provide warmth for a few hours before cooling down. It sounds like a good solution, doesn't it? But it was incredibly dangerous. The stones had to be hot enough to hold heat for hours, which meant they had to be really, really hot. If the cloth wrapping came loose, if you rolled onto the stone in your sleep, you'd get burned. Severe burns. There are historical accounts of people waking up screaming because they'd pressed against a hot stone in their sleep and burned right through their skin. Children were especially at risk. They'd move around more and sleep, and they didn't understand the danger. Burns in the bed were common. And remember, any burn in medieval times could turn into a deadly infection. Even worse, sometimes the cloth wrapping would catch fire. You'd fall asleep with your heated stone tucked down by your feet, and hours later you'd wake up to discover your blanket was smoldering. Or worse, actively burning. Fires that started in beds killed people regularly. They'd be trapped inside those heavy curtains, in the dark, confused and disoriented from sleep, unable to find the opening to get out. They'd burn to death just feet away from safety. So you had this horrible calculation to make every night. Do you risk the burns and the fire to have a few hours of extra warmth? Or do you suffer through the cold and maybe freeze to death? There was no good choice. Either option could kill you. Medieval people lived with these life or death decisions every single day. And let's talk about what it was actually like to get into this bed at night. Remember, your house was freezing. That fire in the middle of the room wasn't producing much heat, and certainly not enough to warm the entire space. So the area where your bed stood was brutally cold. The bed curtains were cold. The blankets were cold. The straw mattress was cold. Everything was so cold that it hurt to touch it. You'd strip down, not to naked. God no, you kept most of your clothes on, but you'd remove the outer layers. And then you'd have to force yourself to climb into that freezing bed. The shock of it must have been terrible. The cold fabric against your skin, the icy straw mattress, your muscles would clench up. You'd start shivering uncontrollably. You'd pull those frozen curtains closed around you, sealing yourself into the darkness, and then you'd just huddle there, shaking, waiting for your body heat to gradually, slowly, warm up the tiny space inside those curtains. It could take an hour or more before you stopped shivering enough to actually fall asleep. And then, just a few hours later, you'd have to wake up and do it all in reverse. You'd have to leave that warm cocoon, the only warm place in the entire house, and face the brutal cold again. Opening those curtains and stepping out of bed must have felt like stepping into ice water. Your warm body hitting that freezing air, your feet touching the frozen floor. This is why medieval people did everything they could to avoid getting out of bed once they were in it. Chamber pots were kept right beside the bed, so you didn't have to go outside to relieve yourself. You'd reach out through a gap in the curtains, use the chamber pot, and quickly seal yourself back in. Because going outside in the middle of a winter night wasn't just unpleasant, it was genuinely dangerous. People froze to death walking just a few yards from their house to an outhouse. For wealthy people, the beds were more elaborate. They had canopies made of expensive fabrics. They had actual feather mattresses, multiple layers of them, which provided much better insulation than straw. They had fur blankets, sometimes made from bear pelts or wolf pelts. But even with all of this luxury, even in the fanciest castles, people were still cold at night. The stone walls of castles absorbed cold like a sponge and radiated it into the rooms. Even with a fire burning in the fireplace, even with the best bed money could buy, nobles still suffered through winter nights. There are accounts of queens and princesses who refused to get out of bed for entire days during the coldest parts of winter. They'd have servants bring them food and drink. They'd conduct business from their beds. They'd even receive visitors while propped up under their blankets. Because leaving the bed meant facing the cold, and why would you do that if you didn't absolutely have to? And here's something truly dark. Your bed was probably the place where you would die. When people got sick in winter, which happened all the time, they'd take to their beds and often never leave. The same bed that was supposed to keep you alive became your deathbed. Families would huddle in bed together, and if someone died during the night, the others might not even notice until morning. The body would just lie there among them until dawn, frozen solid. Children especially died in their sleep. Their little bodies couldn't generate enough heat on their own. Even pressed between their parents, even under all those blankets, the cold would seep in and steal them away. Parents would wake up and discover their child had died sometime in the night, peacefully, without a sound, just gone. The medieval world was full of parents who knew the terror of checking to see if their children were still breathing each morning. The bed was supposed to be your refuge, your shelter, your safe place. And in some ways it was. It was certainly better than sleeping anywhere else. But it was also a place of suffering, of fear, of death. Medieval beds weren't comfortable places of rest like our modern beds. They were survival shelters where you fought to stay alive through each night, never quite sure if you'd wake up in the morning. Here's something that's going to sound absolutely bizarre to modern ears, but it was completely normal in the medieval world. People didn't take their clothes off. Not for days. Not for weeks. Sometimes not for months at a time. From the first freeze of autumn until the spring thaw, many medieval people wore the same clothes continuously, day and night, layer upon layer, never removing them, barely ever washing them. Let me explain why this happened and what it meant. When you're living in a house where the inside temperature is barely above freezing, taking off your clothes isn't just uncomfortable, it's dangerous. Your clothing was the primary thing keeping you alive. The multiple layers of fabric trapped air between them, and that trapped air was insulating you from the cold. Taking off your clothes meant losing that insulation. It meant exposing your skin to air that could literally freeze you to death. So people just didn't do it. When winter arrived, you put on everything you owned, and you kept it on. Let me walk you through what a typical medieval person might be wearing. We'll start with the poorest peasants because that's who most people were. First, against the skin, a linen undergarment, a simple shift for women, a loose shirt for men. This base layer was important because linen can absorb sweat, and keeping the sweat away from your skin was crucial. Wet skin loses heat much faster than dry skin. Over that, a wool tunic, then another wool tunic, then a heavier wool garment, maybe a dress for women, a robe or long coat for men, then a cloak over all of that, the heaviest piece of wool you owned. On your head, a hood or a cap. On your hands, if you were lucky enough to own them, mittens made from wool or leather. On your feet, cloth wrappings or very basic leather shoes stuffed with straw for insulation. And then more cloths wrapped around your legs for extra protection. This was your armor against winter, and you slept in all of it. You'd climb into bed fully dressed, including your hat and your shoes, maybe removing just your outer cloak, but keeping everything else on. Because the bed was cold too, remember? And the more layers you had in bed with you, the warmer you'd be. Now imagine living like this for months. You're wearing these same clothes every day. You're cooking in them, eating in them, working in them, sleeping in them. You're sweating into them. They're absorbing the smoke from your fire, the smell of cooking food, the smell of the animals you're living with. And you're never washing them, because you can't wash them in winter. Water freezes. Even if you could wash them, they wouldn't dry. Wet fabric in winter is deadly. So the clothes just got dirtier and more disgusting as the months went by. The smell must have been absolutely horrific. We're talking about wool that's been soaked in sweat and smoke and food odors for months without washing. Medieval people probably smelled worse than anything we can imagine today. But here's the thing. Everyone smelled terrible. When everyone stinks, nobody really notices anymore. It just becomes normal. Your nose adjusts. It had to, because there was literally no alternative. But the smell was the least of the problems with wearing clothes continuously for months. The real problem was the infestation. Medieval clothing, especially wool, was home to enormous populations of parasites. Lice, fleas, mites, all living in the warm, dark environment of your multiple clothing layers. These parasites would breed in your clothes, laying eggs, creating new generations, until you had hundreds or thousands of insects living on your body at all times. The itching must have driven people absolutely mad. Imagine itching constantly, all day and all night, and not being able to do anything about it. You couldn't take off all your layers to scratch because you'd freeze. You'd try to reach under your clothes to scratch, but you couldn't get to the worst spots. The itching would keep you awake at night. It would distract you during the day, and there was nothing you could do to stop it. Lice are more than just annoying. They carry diseases. Typhus, for one, a disease that killed millions of people in medieval Europe. You'd get typhus from the lice bites, and then you'd die from the fever and the rash and the organ failure that came with it. People had no idea that the lice were the problem. They just knew that they'd get sick and die, and they had no way to prevent it. Fleas were even worse in some ways. Fleas spread the plague, the Black Death, the disease that killed somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's entire population in the 14th century. Those fleas were living in everyone's clothes, biting everyone constantly, and when they bit someone who had the plague and then bit someone else, they spread the disease. Wearing your clothes all the time meant you were basically wearing a disease vector. And then there were infections. The constant friction of dirty, crusty fabric against your skin would cause sores. These sores would get infected. Without antibiotics, infected sores could turn into abscesses, into blood poisoning, into death. It happened all the time. People would develop an infection from something as simple as a chafing spot where their shirt rubbed against their neck, and that infection would kill them. The clothes themselves would deteriorate over the winter. The constant wear, the sweat, the friction, it would break down the fibers. Wool would pill and tear. Seams would split. By the end of winter, many people's clothes were little more than rags barely held together. And they had to keep wearing those rags because they had nothing else. Cloth was expensive. Most people owned only 1 or 2 sets of clothes. When those wore out, you'd have to patch them and mend them and keep wearing them until they literally fell apart. For children, this was even worse. Children grow. A child who started the winter with clothes that fit reasonably well would end the winter wearing clothes that were far too small. The sleeves wouldn't cover their wrists. The hems wouldn't cover their ankles. But there was nothing to do about it. You couldn't make new clothes in winter. So children suffered through the cold in too small clothes that didn't protect them properly, and many of them died from exposure as a result. Now let's talk about the wealthy, because they had it different, but not as different as you might think. Rich people had more clothes, certainly. They might have silk undergarments, which were smoother and less irritating than linen. They might have finer wool, better tailored, with fewer seams to chafe. They might have fur-lined cloaks and robes. But they still layered everything on when winter came, and they still kept it on for months at a time. Even queens and princesses wore multiple layers of clothing to bed. There are accounts of royal women wearing full dresses, gowns, and robes to sleep in, covered with fur blankets. They might have had servants who could heat their bed warmers and bring them hot stones, but they still needed all those layers of fabric to trap heat. And wealthy people still had the parasite problem. Lice don't care if you're rich or poor. They live in any warm fabric, and they spread just as easily in a palace as in a hovel. There are historical records of nobles and even royalty complaining about lice and trying various remedies to get rid of them. Some wore special lice traps, pieces of fabric soaked in honey or tar that were supposed to attract and trap the lice. These didn't work very well. The wealthy could afford to have their clothes washed more often, but even they couldn't wash wool frequently in winter. Water was scarce, fuel to heat water was expensive, and most importantly, the clothes wouldn't dry. So even rich people wore increasingly dirty clothes as winter progressed. There was also the social aspect of clothing that we need to consider. In medieval society, your clothes identified your social status. The quality of fabric, the colors you wore, the style of your garments, all of this told everyone who saw you exactly where you stood in society. Laws actually regulated who could wear what. Peasants weren't allowed to wear silk or certain colors. Only nobles could wear ermine fur. Your clothes were your identity. So as winter progressed and everyone's clothes got dirtier and more ragged, there was probably a sense of social shame and humiliation for many people. You were supposed to maintain your appearance, but you literally couldn't in winter. Your identity as a respectable person was being eroded along with your clothes. For people who had any pride at all, this must have been psychologically devastating. And then spring would finally come. The temperature would rise above freezing. Water would be liquid again, and people could finally take off all those layers. They could wash their bodies, which many of them hadn't done in months. They could wash their clothes, or more likely, throw away the worst of them and make or buy new ones. They could pick the lice out of their hair. They could treat the infections and sores that had developed over the winter. This spring cleaning, this shedding of winter's filth, must have been one of the most satisfying experiences imaginable. To feel clean again, to wear fresh clothes, to not itch constantly. It must have felt like being reborn. But here's the darkest part of this whole situation. Not everyone made it to that spring cleaning. Many people died over the winter still wearing all those layers of filthy clothes. When a family member died, they would often leave the body in bed with them because taking it outside meant going into the freezing cold. The body would freeze solid within hours, and it would stay frozen until the spring thaw. So you might spend weeks sleeping next to your dead father or your dead child, both of you still wearing all your clothes, until the ground was soft enough to dig a grave. And when bodies were finally buried in spring, they were usually buried in the clothes they died in. Nobody was going to strip a frozen corpse and wash those clothes for reuse, no matter how desperately they needed clothing. So the clothes went into the ground with the body, taking with them all the lice and fleas and disease that had accumulated over the winter. The psychological impact of living like this is hard for us to comprehend. We're so used to changing clothes daily, to showering regularly, to feeling clean. The idea of wearing the same filthy, itchy, stinking, parasite-infested clothes for 4 or 5 months straight is beyond our ability to imagine. But medieval people had no choice. It was wear your clothes constantly or freeze to death. Those were the only options. This is why, when you read medieval texts, you find so many references to people longing for spring, counting the days until warmth returned. They weren't just looking forward to warmer weather in an abstract sense. They were desperately, urgently waiting for the day when they could take off these horrible clothes and feel like human beings again. Spring wasn't just a season. It was liberation from a prison of fabric and filth that had trapped them all winter long. Now we need to talk about something that sounds absolutely insane to modern people, but was completely normal in the medieval world. Animals lived inside houses with people, not just occasionally, not just as pets, but as a deliberate survival strategy during winter. Families would bring their livestock, their cows, their pigs, their chickens, their sheep, into their homes and keep them there for months because the animals produced body heat, and that body heat could mean the difference between life and death. Think about what this means. Imagine your house right now. Now imagine bringing a cow into your living room. Actually, not just one cow, but maybe 2 or 3 cows, plus several pigs, a dozen chickens, maybe some goats and sheep. All of these animals living in the same space where you sleep, where you eat, where you cook, where you spend every moment of the long winter months. This was reality for millions of medieval people. The design of many medieval peasant houses actually reflected this practice. The house would be divided into 2 sections, sometimes with a partial wall, sometimes just with an invisible line everyone understood. One section was for the humans. The other section was for the animals. But that division was minimal. The animals weren't really separated. They were right there, breathing the same air, sharing the same space. Why would anyone do this? The answer is simple. Animals are warm-blooded. They generate heat. A cow produces a lot of heat, actually. A large cow generates about as much heat as a small heater would. So having 3 or 4 cows in your house is like having 3 or 4 heaters running constantly. That warmth radiates out into the space, raising the overall temperature by a few precious degrees. Those few degrees could be what kept you alive. But there was another reason too. The animals themselves were valuable. They were your wealth, your food source, your future. Cows produced milk even in winter, though not as much as in summer. Chickens might still lay a few eggs. And you needed these animals to survive until spring, because if they died, you'd have no way to plow your fields, no way to produce food next year. Keeping them inside protected them from the cold and from predators like wolves that were more aggressive in winter when food was scarce. So the humans and the animals were basically dependent on each other. The humans needed the animals' body heat to stay warm. The animals needed the shelter of the house to survive. It was a mutual survival arrangement. But that doesn't mean it was pleasant. Not even close. Let's start with the smell. Animal waste has a very strong odor, as anyone who has ever been near a farm knows. Now imagine that smell concentrated inside a small enclosed space with no ventilation. The ammonia from urine would burn your eyes and throat. The smell of manure would be overwhelming, and there was no way to escape it. You couldn't open windows because that would let in the cold. You couldn't go outside because it was freezing out there. You just had to live with that smell, breathing it in with every breath for months. The animals would urinate and defecate right there in the house. Some families tried to keep the animal area slightly lower than the human area so that the waste would drain away from where people slept. Some put down straw to absorb the waste, which they'd have to change periodically, dragging the soiled straw outside and replacing it with fresh straw when they could get it. But no matter what they did, the house was essentially a barn, and it smelled like a barn. The health implications of this were severe. Animal waste contains bacteria, parasites, and pathogens that can make humans very sick. E. coli, salmonella, various intestinal parasites. All of these could spread from animals to humans in close quarters. Medieval people had constant digestive problems, constant intestinal infections. They thought it was just normal to have diarrhea frequently. They didn't understand that they were getting sick from living in close proximity to animal waste. The air quality was terrible for another reason too. Animals breathe, and they produce carbon dioxide just like humans do. But animals are bigger and breathe more. So the carbon dioxide levels in these houses must have been dangerously high. Combined with the smoke from the fire and the ammonia from the urine, the air inside a medieval peasant house in winter was basically toxic. People were breathing poison all the time, and they had no idea. The animals themselves could be dangerous too. Cows are big, powerful creatures. A cow can weigh well over 1,000 pounds. If a cow got startled in the middle of the night and kicked out, it could seriously injure or kill a person. Children were especially at risk. There are records of children being trampled or crushed by livestock that were sharing their homes. Parents had to constantly worry about their children getting too close to the animals. But in a small space, how could you avoid it? Pigs are actually quite intelligent, but also aggressive when they're hungry or scared. A pig can bite hard enough to take off a finger. And pigs will eat almost anything, including babies if given the chance. There are horrifying historical accounts of infants being attacked and killed by pigs that were kept inside homes. Medieval parents had to watch their youngest children constantly, never letting them get near the pigs, which again, was almost impossible in a one-room house. Even chickens could cause problems. Chickens carry diseases like salmonella and avian flu. They also produce a fine dust from their feathers that can cause respiratory problems when inhaled constantly. And chickens are noisy. They cluck and squawk at all hours. Try to imagine trying to sleep in a room with a dozen chickens making noise all night long. It must have been maddening. The animals needed to be fed too, of course. You couldn't just let them out to graze in winter when everything was covered in snow. So you had to store hay and grain for them, which took up space and attracted rats and mice. The rodents would come into the house to eat the animal feed, and then they'd eat your food too. Rats spread diseases, especially plague. Having animals in your house meant attracting rats, which meant increasing your risk of disease even more. And here's something that's particularly tragic. Despite all of this effort, despite bringing the animals inside and sharing your space with them, they died anyway. Animals aren't as hardy as you might think. When the really cold weather hit, when temperatures dropped far below freezing for weeks at a time, the animals would start to die. Cows would stop producing milk because they weren't getting enough food. Chickens would stop laying eggs. Pigs would lose weight rapidly and become weak. When an animal died inside your house, you had a serious problem. A dead cow weighs over 1,000 pounds. How are you supposed to get that out of your house when you can barely move yourself in the cold? Often, the dead animal would just have to stay there, frozen in place, until the weather warmed up enough that you could drag it outside. So you'd be living with a dead cow in your house for days or weeks. The smell of decay, even in the cold, was terrible, and the dead animal would attract scavengers. Wolves, foxes, even ravens would try to get into the house to feed on the carcass. Some families, in truly desperate situations, would butcher the dead animal right there in the house and eat the meat. This was risky because if the animal died from disease, eating the meat could make you sick too. But when you're starving, you'll take that risk. So people would cut up a dead cow or pig on their dirt floor, trying to preserve the meat by salting it or smoking it. all while still living in that same space. For families who managed to keep their animals alive through the winter, there was still the problem of the animals' behavior. Cows in heat, bulls becoming aggressive, pigs fighting over food, chickens establishing pecking orders. All of the natural animal behaviors that would normally happen outside in a field were happening inside your house. The noise, the violence between animals, the constant disruption. It made an already difficult situation even more chaotic and stressful. And let's talk about the intimacy issue. Medieval people had no privacy to begin with. The entire family slept in one room, often in one bed. But now you were also sharing that space with animals. There was no privacy for anything. Not for bathing, not for using the chamber pot, not for intimate moments between husband and wife. Everything happened in full view of the livestock. This must have been psychologically damaging in ways we can barely understand. Children growing up in these conditions often developed respiratory problems from breathing the contaminated air. Their lungs would be damaged by the ammonia, the animal dander, the smoke, all of it. Many children didn't survive to adulthood. The ones who did often had chronic health problems for the rest of their lives. Coughs that never went away, difficulty breathing, susceptibility to pneumonia and other lung infections. The wealthy had slightly different arrangements. They didn't bring livestock into their personal living spaces, but their animals were still kept very close by, in ground-level stables that were part of the castle or manor house. The smell and the noise would rise up through the floors into the living areas above. And wealthy people still sometimes brought smaller animals like hunting dogs or pet birds into their bedrooms for warmth. Even queens had dogs sleeping in their beds. There's a reason why medieval people celebrated spring so enthusiastically. One of the biggest reasons was that they could finally get the animals out of their houses. They could open the doors and windows and air everything out. They could shovel out months of accumulated animal waste. They could scrub the floors, though with just water and maybe some sand since soap was expensive and rare. They could breathe clean air for the first time in months. But until that spring day arrived, they were trapped. Trapped in close quarters with animals that were just as miserable as they were. The animals wanted to be outside too. They wanted to move around, to graze, to express their natural behaviors. But they were stuck inside, just like the humans, everyone suffering together through the endless winter. This arrangement, this necessity of living with animals, tells us something important about medieval life. It tells us how desperate people were, how few options they had. They were willing to endure these terrible conditions, to sacrifice their health and their comfort and their dignity, just for the chance to survive a little longer. The animal's body heat was that valuable. A few degrees of warmth was worth living in what was essentially a barn full of animal waste and disease. And yet, even with the animal's heat, even with the fire, even with all the layers of clothing and the curtained beds, people still froze. The cold was that brutal. The winters were that harsh. Everything medieval people did, every desperate measure they took, was barely enough. And for many, it wasn't enough at all. We need to have a serious conversation about what it was actually like to breathe every moment of every day for months on end was slowly killing them. I'm not being dramatic. The indoor air quality in medieval homes was genuinely toxic, and it caused countless deaths that people at the time didn't understand and couldn't prevent. Let's start with the obvious problem: smoke. We talked earlier about the open fire pits in the middle of rooms, but I don't think I fully conveyed just how smoky these houses were. When I say the house was full of smoke, I mean you couldn't see across the room. Your eyes would water constantly from the irritation. Your throat would hurt. You'd cough and cough and cough, and there was no relief because you couldn't escape the smoke. It was everywhere, all the time. The fire was burning wood, but not always good, dry wood. Often people had to burn whatever they could find. Wet wood, green wood, wood that had been sitting in snow. This produced even more smoke than dry wood. Thick, acrid smoke that would fill the room and just hang there because it had nowhere to go. The hole in the roof that was supposed to let the smoke out was small, remember, because you didn't want to lose too much heat. So most of the smoke stayed inside. The smoke would eventually form layers. The heaviest, thickest smoke would hang at about head height if you were standing up. This is why medieval people often sat or crouched close to the ground. The air was slightly clearer down there. Children, being smaller, actually had a slight advantage because they were naturally breathing the clearer air near the floor. But when you had to stand up to do work, to cook, to tend the fire, you'd be breathing the worst of the smoke. Your lungs would coat with soot. If you could look inside the lungs of a medieval person who had lived through multiple winters, they'd be black. Completely black with accumulated soot and tar. The tiny air sacs in the lungs, the alveoli that are supposed to transfer oxygen into your blood, would be clogged with particulates. This made it harder and harder to breathe effectively. You'd always feel slightly short of breath. Physical exertion would leave you gasping. The long-term effects of breathing smoke constantly were devastating. Chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, what we call COPD today, was incredibly common. People's lungs would become so damaged that they couldn't function properly. You'd see adults in their 30s or 40s who were already struggling to breathe, wheezing with every breath, coughing up black phlegm constantly. These people were dying from lung disease caused by the very fire that was keeping them warm. Lung cancer was common too, though medieval people had no concept of cancer. They just knew that sometimes people would develop terrible coughs that got worse and worse. They'd start coughing up blood, they'd lose weight, they'd become too weak to work, and then they'd die. This happened so frequently, it was almost expected. If you made it to old age, you were probably going to die from something related to your lungs. But smoke wasn't the only problem with the air. There was also carbon monoxide, that invisible killer I mentioned earlier. Carbon monoxide is produced whenever you burn something in an environment with insufficient oxygen. An open fire pit in a small, sealed room produces a lot of carbon monoxide. And carbon monoxide is insidious because you can't detect it with your senses. You can't see it, smell it, or taste it. What carbon monoxide does is bind to the hemoglobin in your blood, the molecules that are supposed to carry oxygen to your cells. The carbon monoxide binds much more strongly than oxygen does, which means your blood can't carry oxygen effectively. Your cells start to suffocate even though you're breathing. The first symptoms are headache, dizziness, nausea. You feel confused and weak. If the exposure continues, you lose consciousness. Then you die. Medieval families would seal up their houses as tightly as possible to keep out the cold. They'd hang cloth over the windows, stuff rags into every crack and gap in the walls. They'd do everything they could to stop cold air from getting in. But this also meant fresh air couldn't get in. The oxygen levels would drop while the carbon monoxide levels rose. And people would just go to sleep and never wake up. The tragedy is that carbon monoxide poisoning feels like falling asleep. You don't really suffer. You just get drowsy and drift off. So a family might all lie down to sleep, and by morning, they're all dead. The fire is still burning, or maybe it's burned down to embers. But everyone is dead, killed by the invisible gas they were breathing all night. This happened regularly enough that medieval people thought houses could be cursed. They'd find families dead with no signs of violence, no obvious cause of death, and they'd think it was demons or evil spirits. They'd sometimes refuse to live in a house where this had happened, believing it was haunted. They never understood that the house itself was fine. The problem was the fire and the lack of ventilation. Now add to the smoke and carbon monoxide the fact that you've got animals living in the same space. Animals breathe out carbon dioxide. Lots of carbon dioxide. A cow produces about 20 times more carbon dioxide than a human. So if you've got 3 cows in your house, that's like having 60 extra people breathing in there. The carbon dioxide levels would be incredibly high. High carbon dioxide levels make you feel tired, sluggish, unable to think clearly. You'd have constant headaches. You'd feel anxious and restless without knowing why. Your heart would race. You'd feel like you couldn't get enough air, because you actually couldn't. The air didn't have enough oxygen in it to properly oxygenate your blood. And then there's the ammonia from the animal urine. Ammonia is a gas that's extremely irritating to the respiratory system. It burns the mucous membranes in your nose, throat, and lungs. Chronic exposure to ammonia causes permanent damage to these tissues. Your nose would run constantly. Your throat would be raw and painful. Your eyes would sting and water. And there was no escape from it because the ammonia was being produced constantly by the animals. The combination of all these factors, smoke, carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, ammonia, created an atmosphere that was genuinely poisonous. And medieval people breathed this poison every day of winter. The fact that anyone survived is actually remarkable, but many didn't survive. The death rate in winter was far higher than in summer, and respiratory problems were one of the main causes. Children and elderly people were especially vulnerable. Children's lungs are still developing, and this toxic environment damaged them permanently. Many children who survived winter would have weakened lungs for the rest of their lives, making them susceptible to pneumonia and other respiratory infections. The elderly, whose lungs were already damaged from decades of breathing smoke, often couldn't survive another winter. They'd develop pneumonia or bronchitis and die within days. Pregnant women faced particular dangers. The lack of oxygen in the blood, caused by carbon monoxide exposure, meant the developing baby wasn't getting enough oxygen either. This caused developmental problems, stillbirths, and premature deliveries. Women who were pregnant during winter had significantly higher rates of miscarriage and infant mortality than women who were pregnant during summer. And here's something truly horrifying. Medieval people had to make a choice every day. Do you open a window or door to let in fresh air, which would also let in the cold? Or do you keep everything sealed tight to stay warm, which means breathing poisonous air? Both choices could kill you. Fresh air meant freezing. Sealed air meant poisoning. There was no good option. Most people chose to stay warm and suffer the consequences of the bad air. They'd rather deal with headaches and coughing than freeze to death. This was probably the right choice for immediate survival, but it meant slow, cumulative damage to their health that would shorten their lives. Some houses had small holes or gaps in the walls that weren't fully sealed. These provided a tiny bit of ventilation, just enough to prevent the worst carbon monoxide poisoning. But even these small gaps let in cold air, creating drafts that would blow right across sleeping people, causing them to freeze on one side while the other side roasted from the fire. You try to position yourself to avoid the drafts, but in a crowded house full of people and animals, you couldn't always manage it. The wealthy had slightly better air quality, but only slightly. Their castles and manor houses were so large that the smoke dispersed more. They had higher ceilings, so the smoke rose further above head level. Some had actual chimneys that vented smoke outside. But even wealthy people suffered from respiratory problems. Even kings and queens coughed constantly, struggled with lung infections, died from pneumonia. There are historical accounts of medieval physicians recommending that sick people breathe better air. They understood that air quality mattered, even if they didn't understand why. They'd sometimes advise patients to sleep sitting up because the air was slightly better higher up. Or they'd recommend sleeping near a window, even if it was cold. But for most people, these recommendations were impossible to follow. You couldn't redesign your house. You couldn't afford to sleep near a cold window. You just had to breathe the air you had. The psychological impact of never being able to breathe clean air is something we should consider too. Imagine never, ever feeling like you're getting a full, satisfying breath. Always feeling slightly suffocated, slightly oxygen deprived. Always having a headache. Always feeling tired. This was normal for medieval people in winter. They didn't know anything different. But it must have contributed to depression, to irritability, to the general misery of winter life. And when spring finally came, when doors and windows could be opened again, when fresh air could flow through houses for the first time in months, people must have felt transformed. To breathe deeply without coughing, to not have watering eyes, to not have a constant headache, to feel alert and clear-headed. It must have been like being given a new body, but the damage was already done. Lungs damaged by months of smoke exposure don't fully heal. Scarring is permanent. Each winter made the damage worse. People's lung capacity decreased year by year until eventually, they couldn't survive another winter. Their lungs were just too damaged. They'd develop pneumonia or bronchitis and die because their lungs couldn't fight off the infection anymore. This is why medieval life expectancy was so low. Yes, infant mortality was high. Yes, disease killed many people. Yes, violence and accidents took a toll. But chronic exposure to terrible air quality throughout life was also a major factor. People's bodies were slowly breaking down from breathing poison for months at a time, year after year, from childhood until death. The air inside a medieval house in winter was legitimately one of the most dangerous aspects of medieval life. It killed more slowly than a sword or an arrow, but it killed just as surely. And there was almost nothing anyone could do about it except endure and hope they'd survive until spring. Now let's talk about something that seems simple, but was actually another major crisis in medieval winter: food and water. Not just the shortage of food, though that was certainly a problem. I'm talking about the basic physical challenge of accessing, preparing, and consuming food and water when everything around you is frozen solid. Let's start with water, because water is essential to life. You can survive for weeks without food, but only days without water. In summer, getting water was relatively straightforward. You'd go to a well, or a stream, or collect rainwater. But in the depths of winter, water sources froze. Wells would freeze over with thick ice. Streams and rivers would turn to solid ice. Even the water you kept stored inside your house would freeze solid. Picture this. You wake up in the morning, desperately thirsty. Your mouth is dry from breathing smoky air all night. You need water, but the bucket of water that you left sitting by the fire the night before is now a solid block of ice. The water has frozen despite being inside the house, despite being near the fire, because the house is so cold that water can't stay liquid. So what do? You have to break the ice. You'd take a knife or an axe and chip away at the frozen water, breaking off chunks of ice. Then you'd have to melt these chunks. You'd put them in a pot and hold it over the fire, waiting for the ice to turn back into water. This process took time and fuel and energy. Just to get a drink of water, you had to go through this whole procedure. And you had to do this multiple times a day, every day, for months. Every time anyone in the family needed water to drink, to cook with, to wash anything, you had to melt ice first. Think about how much water a family uses. For drinking, for cooking, for cleaning wounds, for making the thin soups and porridges that were the main winter foods. You needed a lot of water, and all of it had to be melted from ice. The fuel cost of melting all this ice was significant. Remember, firewood was precious and often scarce. Using your limited wood to melt ice meant less wood available for heating and cooking. You had to constantly make these terrible calculations. Do we melt more ice so we can have water, or do we conserve our wood so we don't freeze tonight? Both water and warmth were essential, but you couldn't always have enough of both. Some families tried to keep water from freezing by keeping it right next to the fire, as close as possible. But this created its own problems. Water sitting that close to an open fire would get contaminated with ash and soot. You'd be drinking dirty water, which could make you sick. But it was better than dying of thirst, so that's what people did. Wells were another problem. Even if the surface ice could be broken, which required hard labor with pick and axe, the water drawn up from deep wells was so cold it would start to freeze almost immediately when exposed to the air. Drawing water from a well in winter was dangerous too. The ground around the well would be icy and slippery. People would slip and fall into wells, drowning in the freezing water below. Children especially were at risk. Some communities tried to keep one central well from freezing by maintaining a fire near it constantly. People would take turns keeping this fire burning day and night. But this required a huge amount of wood, and not every village could afford to do it. Smaller, poorer communities just had to deal with frozen wells and do their best. Now let's talk about food storage. Medieval people preserved food for winter in several ways. They'd dry meat and fish, salt them, smoke them. They'd store root vegetables like turnips and carrots in underground cellars. They'd keep grain in sacks and barrels. But in winter, all of this food would freeze solid. A salted ham hanging from your ceiling would freeze into a rock-hard mass. You couldn't cut it. You couldn't eat it. It had to be thawed first, which again required the fire, required time, required precious fuel. The same with dried fish. The same with any meat you'd preserved. Everything was so frozen that you couldn't even bite into it. Your teeth would break if you tried. Root vegetables stored in cellars would freeze despite being underground. Turnips would turn to solid ice. Carrots would freeze and then turn to mush when they thawed, becoming inedible. Families would lose significant portions of their food stores to freezing and subsequent rot. Food that had taken months to grow and harvest and preserve would be destroyed by the cold, and there was nothing they could do about it. Grain stored in sacks would sometimes freeze too, especially if there was any moisture in it. Frozen grain was hard to grind into flour. Mills often couldn't operate in winter anyway because the streams that powered them were frozen. So families had to grind grain by hand using stones, which was exhausting labor. And if the grain was frozen, it was even harder. Bread, the staple food of medieval life, became problematic in winter. Freshly baked bread would freeze within hours if not kept right by the fire. Frozen bread was too hard to eat. You'd have to thaw it, and the thawing process would make it stale and unpalatable. But you'd eat it anyway because you had no choice. Many families ate only one cooked meal per day in winter, usually in the evening. They couldn't afford the fuel to cook multiple times. This meant they'd prepare a big pot of soup or porridge or stew, and everyone would eat from that. But what about the rest of the day? They'd eat cold food, frozen bread, frozen cheese if they had any, chunks of frozen salted meat that they'd suck on to soften. Their bodies were constantly cold, and they were eating frozen food, which made them even colder. The nutrition in winter diets was terrible. Without fresh fruits or vegetables, medieval people suffered from vitamin deficiencies. Scurvy, caused by lack of vitamin C, was common. Your gums would bleed. Your teeth would fall out. Old wounds would reopen. You'd bruise easily. Without vitamin A, you'd develop night blindness. Without vitamin D, especially since there was so little sunlight in winter, you'd develop rickets if you were a child, bone pain, and weakness if you were an adult. Malnutrition weakened people's immune systems, making them more susceptible to disease. A well-nourished person might fight off an infection. A malnourished person would die from it. Winter was a time of slow starvation for many people. They weren't getting enough calories, and what calories they did get came from a monotonous diet of grain products with little nutritional variety. Children suffered especially from malnutrition. Their growth would be stunted. You can actually see this in skeletal remains from the medieval period. Archaeologists have found evidence of growth arrest lines in bones, places where growth stopped temporarily due to starvation or severe illness. These lines often correspond to winter months. Children would stop growing in winter, then resume growth in spring if they survived. Babies and toddlers had the highest death rates. Infants who were being breastfed depended entirely on their mother's milk. But mothers who were malnourished couldn't produce enough milk, or the milk they produced wasn't nutritious enough. Babies would slowly starve while nursing, their mothers unable to provide what they needed. The guilt and anguish mothers must have felt, watching their babies waste away while being unable to help them, is heartbreaking to think about. When food supplies ran dangerously low, families had to make terrible decisions about who got to eat. Usually, the working adults ate first because they had to stay strong enough to work. Children ate second. Elderly people who couldn't work anymore often got the least food. In the worst situations, elderly family members would sometimes voluntarily stop eating, sacrificing themselves so that the younger generations would have enough food to survive. There are documented cases of people eating things that weren't really food in desperate attempts to fill their stomachs. Tree bark, grass, leather from shoes and belts, even dirt. These substances provided no nutrition and could actually make you sicker. Eating leather could cause intestinal blockages. Eating dirt could introduce parasites. But when you're starving, when your stomach is cramping from hunger, you'll try anything. The wealthy had more food stores, certainly. Their larders were better stocked. They had smoked meats, preserved fruits, imported spices, and dried goods. But even they dealt with frozen food. Even they watched their stores dwindle as winter stretched on. And even wealthy people couldn't get fresh food in the dead of winter. A king might have better dried meat than a peasant, but it was still dried meat, still frozen, still monotonous. The psychological impact of the winter diet was significant too. Imagine eating essentially the same meal every day for months. The same porridge, the same stale bread, the same hard chunks of salted meat. No variety, no freshness, no flavor beyond salt and smoke. Food, which could be one of life's pleasures, became simply fuel, barely palatable fuel at that. This added to the general misery and depression of winter. And then there was the constant hunger. Even people who had food were always hungry because they were rationing it, making it stretch as far as possible to last until spring. You'd eat just enough to keep functioning, but never enough to feel satisfied. That gnawing hunger in your belly was your constant companion all winter long. You'd go to sleep hungry. You'd wake up hungry. You'd work hungry. Always hungry. When people finally died from starvation, it was often slow. Your body would consume itself, breaking down fat stores first, then muscle tissue. You'd become skeletal, too weak to stand. Your mind would become confused. You'd have strange visions. Eventually, your organs would fail. Your heart would stop. But this process could take weeks, during which you suffered terribly while your family watched, helpless to save you. The arrival of spring meant fresh food again. New grass for animals to graze on, which meant fresh milk. Young plants that could be foraged and eaten. Eventually, the first crops would be ready to harvest. But there was a dangerous gap in early spring called the Hungry Gap, where winter stores had run out, but new food wasn't ready yet. Many people who had survived all winter would die during the Hungry Gap, so close to salvation, but not quite making it. The medieval relationship with food and water in winter was one of constant struggle and anxiety. Every meal required enormous effort. Every drink of water required melting ice. Every day you had to calculate whether your food would last, whether you'd survive until spring. And for many, despite their best efforts, the answer was no. We need to talk now about what happens to the human body when it gets too cold. Not just uncomfortable cold, but dangerously, lethally cold. Because frostbite and hypothermia were constant threats in the medieval winter, and they caused deaths that were both common and horrifying. Let's start with frostbite, because frostbite is what happens when your body's survival mechanisms turn against you. When you're exposed to extreme cold, your body tries to protect your vital organs, your heart, your lungs, your brain. It does this by restricting blood flow to your extremities. Your fingers, toes, nose, ears, these become expendable in your body's desperate attempt to keep your core alive. When blood flow is cut off from these areas, the tissue starts to freeze. Water inside cells turns to ice, forming sharp crystals that puncture cell membranes from the inside. The cells die, and once the cells are dead, the tissue is dead. It will never recover. In the early stages of frostbite, the affected area will turn white or grayish. It will feel numb. You might not even realize it's happening because you can't feel the affected area anymore. As frostbite progresses, the tissue turns blue, then black as it dies completely. This is called necrosis, the medical term for dead tissue. And dead tissue doesn't come back to life. It stays attached to your body for a while, looking increasingly horrifying, until eventually it either has to be cut off or it falls off on its own. Medieval people suffered from frostbite constantly. Poor people who couldn't afford good shoes or mittens would lose fingers and toes every winter. Workers who had to go outside to gather firewood or care for animals would come back with white, numb hands and feet. By the time they felt the pain, it was often too late. The damage was already done. Children playing in the snow, not understanding the danger, would stay out too long. Their little fingers and toes would freeze. Parents would bring them inside and try to warm them by the fire, which was actually the worst thing they could do. Rapid rewarming of frozen tissue causes excruciating pain and can make the damage worse. But medieval people didn't know this. They just knew their children were frozen and needed to be warmed. The pain of frostbite as it thaws is indescribable. People who have experienced it say it feels like your extremities are being crushed and burned at the same time. The pain is so intense that grown adults would scream and cry like children. And this pain could last for hours as the tissue thawed. Imagine a house full of people, all suffering from various degrees of frostbite, all in terrible pain, and there's nothing anyone can do to help except wait for it to pass. Once the immediate pain subsided, the real horror began. The dead tissue would start to rot while still attached to the body. This is called gangrene. The fingers or toes would turn black, then green, and they'd start to smell. The smell of rotting flesh is something that can never be forgotten by anyone who's experienced it. It's sweet and putrid at the same time, and it permeates everything. Your clothes, your bed, your house. You can't escape it. Gangrene is also deadly. The infection from the rotting tissue can spread into your bloodstream, causing sepsis, which will kill you. The only treatment is amputation. You have to remove the dead tissue before the infection spreads. But medieval surgery was primitive and incredibly dangerous. There was no anesthesia, no antibiotics, no understanding of sterilization. If you were lucky enough to have access to a barber surgeon, they would tie you down and cut off your dead fingers or toes while you were fully conscious. They'd use a saw for larger amputations. The pain was unimaginable. Many people died from shock during the surgery. Others died from the inevitable infection that followed. The survival rate for amputations was probably less than 50%. Most people couldn't afford a surgeon anyway, so they'd either live with the rotting tissue, knowing it was killing them, or they'd try to remove it themselves. They'd wait until the dead tissue was so necrotic that it was barely attached anymore. Then they'd cut it off with a knife or just twist it until it came off. Some people lost all their fingers and toes this way, one at a time, over multiple winters. Living without fingers or toes was incredibly difficult. You couldn't work properly. You couldn't grip tools. You couldn't walk normally. In a society where everyone had to work to survive, losing your fingers or toes often meant a slow death from poverty and starvation. You became a burden on your family. Some people with severe frostbite injuries would end up begging, living off charity, barely surviving. Frostbite also affected noses and ears. These would freeze, turn black, and fall off. You'd see people with missing noses, missing ears, or with these body parts partially destroyed. It was common enough that it wasn't even particularly remarkable. Just another sign that someone had survived winter, but barely. Now let's talk about hypothermia, which is what happens when your entire body gets too cold, not just your extremities. Your core temperature starts to drop. Normal human body temperature is around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit or 37 degrees Celsius. When it drops below about 95 degrees Fahrenheit or 35 degrees Celsius, you're hypothermic. The first stage of hypothermia is actually your body's attempt to save itself. You start shivering violently. The muscle contractions generate heat, trying to warm you up. But shivering requires energy, burns calories, and if you're already malnourished, you might not have the energy to sustain it. Your muscles will eventually become exhausted, and the shivering will stop. This is a very bad sign. As hypothermia progresses, you become confused and disoriented. Your thinking becomes muddled. You make poor decisions. This is incredibly dangerous because you might do things that make your situation worse. You might wander away from shelter. You might take off your clothes because, in a cruel trick of hypothermia, you suddenly feel hot. This is called paradoxical undressing, and it happens because the cold affects your brain's ability to regulate temperature properly. Medieval people would sometimes find travelers who had frozen to death completely naked in the snow, their clothes scattered around them. They thought these people had been attacked by demons or evil spirits. They didn't understand that the person had undressed themselves in a state of hypothermic confusion. The person had essentially been killed by their own damaged brain. As your core temperature continues to drop, your heart rate slows down. Your breathing becomes shallow. You lose consciousness, and then your heart stops. You die. The process from the first stages of hypothermia to death could take hours, and during those hours, you'd be suffering terribly. But here's something particularly tragic. Hypothermia was most dangerous at night when people were sleeping. You'd go to bed feeling cold, but okay. During the night, your body temperature would continue to drop. If you were elderly, or very young, or sick, your body couldn't generate enough heat to compensate. You'd slip into deeper and deeper hypothermia while you slept, and you'd never wake up. This is how many children died. They'd go to sleep between their parents, and by morning they'd be cold and stiff. The parents would wake up to find their child dead, frozen during the night despite being under all the blankets, despite the parents' best efforts to keep them warm. Imagine the guilt and horror of that. You were lying right next to your child, and they died anyway, and you didn't even know it was happening. Elderly people were also highly vulnerable. As you age, your body becomes less efficient at regulating temperature. You don't generate as much heat. You don't shiver as effectively. An elderly person would be cold all the time in winter, and eventually, their body just couldn't keep up anymore. They'd die of hypothermia, often in their sleep, quietly, and without anyone being able to prevent it. The sick were at high risk too. If you had a fever or an infection, your body was already stressed. It couldn't fight both the illness and the cold. Many people who might have survived an illness in summer would die from the same illness in winter, not because the illness itself was more deadly, but because the combination of illness and cold was too much for their bodies to handle. What made hypothermia particularly insidious in medieval times was that there was no way to effectively rewarm someone who was severely hypothermic. If you found someone who was nearly frozen, you'd bring them inside, put them by the fire, pile blankets on them. But if they were too far gone, these measures wouldn't work. Their body couldn't absorb the heat fast enough. They'd die anyway, sometimes hours after being brought to warmth. Worse, rapid rewarming could actually be dangerous. When you warm someone quickly, blood vessels dilate and blood rushes to the extremities. This can cause a drop in blood pressure and can actually make the core temperature drop even further, a phenomenon called afterdrop. Medieval people didn't understand this. They'd put someone right next to the fire, trying to warm them as quickly as possible, and the person would die not from the cold, but from the rapid rewarming. There was also no way to predict who would survive winter and who wouldn't. Two people with similar health and similar circumstances might have completely different outcomes. One would survive, one would die. This randomness made winter terrifying. You could do everything right and still die. You could be strong and healthy going into winter and dead by January. The bodies of people who died from hypothermia would freeze solid within hours. They'd become like statues, rigid and impossible to move. If someone died during the night, their body would freeze in whatever position it was in. You couldn't straighten the limbs. You couldn't close the eyes. The body would just be frozen in a grotesque tableau of death. Burying these frozen bodies was impossible because the ground was frozen too. You couldn't dig through frozen earth. So bodies would have to be stored somewhere until spring. Some families would put their dead in outbuildings or barns. Others would pile snow over them to preserve them and keep animals away. The bodies would stay frozen all winter, a grim reminder of winter's toll. When spring finally came and the ground thawed, there would be mass burials. All the people who had died over the winter would be buried in a short period of time. The village cemetery would suddenly fill with fresh graves. This spring death count was one of the ways people measured how severe the winter had been. A mild winter might see a few deaths. A harsh winter could kill 10, 20, even 30% of the population. Some villages kept death records, and when you look at these records, the pattern is stark. Deaths would spike dramatically from November through March, then drop off in April and May. The correlation with temperature was absolute. Cold killed, and it killed predictably. Certain winters were particularly deadly and became famous or infamous in their own right. The winter of 1315 was part of the Great Famine and killed millions. The winter of 1407 saw massive snowstorms and freezing temperatures across Europe. The winter of 1709, during the Little Ice Age, was so cold that even the Mediterranean Sea partially froze. These extreme winters could depopulate entire regions. Medieval people lived with the constant fear that this winter might be one of the deadly ones. They'd watch the weather anxiously. An early freeze meant a long winter. Heavy snowfall meant they might be trapped in their houses for weeks. A particularly cold snap could mean death for the weakest members of the family. Every day you survived was a small victory. Every night you made it through was a relief. The psychological trauma of watching family members die from the cold must have been overwhelming. And yet people couldn't really grieve properly. You couldn't afford to break down emotionally when you still had to keep the fire going, still had to keep yourself and your remaining family members alive. Grief was a luxury you couldn't afford until spring came and you were safe. Children who grew up in this environment, who watched siblings die from cold, who saw parents and grandparents freeze to death, were traumatized in ways we can barely imagine. They learned early that the world was brutal and unforgiving. They learned that you could do everything right and still die. This created a kind of fatalism, a sense that your life was in God's hands and there was nothing you could do to guarantee survival. Some historians believe this is one reason why medieval people were so religious. When your life could be taken by something as simple as a cold night, when you had so little control over your own survival, belief in a higher power and an afterlife became psychologically necessary. The promise of heaven made the suffering of this life bearable. But belief didn't keep you warm. Faith didn't prevent frostbite. Prayer didn't cure hypothermia. When the cold came, it killed without regard for piety or virtue. The most devout believer died just as easily as the skeptic. The cold was the ultimate equalizer, caring nothing for your prayers or your tears. This is why spring was greeted with such profound relief and joy. Winter's death toll was finally over. The killing season had ended. Everyone who had survived could finally breathe, could finally believe they'd make it to another year. The dead would be buried and mourned properly. The living could start to heal, both physically and emotionally, from the trauma of winter. But even as they celebrated spring, even as they thanked God for their survival, medieval people knew that next winter was coming. It was always coming. The cycle was endless. And all they could do was prepare as best they could and hope they'd be lucky enough to survive one more time. When you're slowly freezing to death, when your children are crying from hunger and cold, when you've run out of firewood, and it's only January with months of winter still ahead, you'll do things you never thought possible. You'll take desperate measures. You'll make choices that would seem insane in any other circumstance. This segment is about those desperate, dangerous survival tactics that medieval people employed when there was no other option left. Let's start with the most common desperate measure, burning furniture. You've run out of firewood. You've burned every stick, every branch, every piece of wood you could find. But you still need fire or you'll freeze. So you look around your house. and you realize that your house is made of wood. Your furniture is made of wood. These things can burn. It starts small. Maybe you burn a stool. Just one small stool, broken up and fed into the fire. It gives you a few hours of heat. That seems acceptable. But the next day, you need more wood. So you burn another chair. Then the table. Then the bed frame. Before long, you're systematically destroying your own furniture to stay warm. There are historical records of families who burned nearly everything they owned. All their furniture, their doors, even the wooden shutters on their windows. By the end of winter, they were living in what was essentially an empty shell of a house, sitting on the dirt floor, no furniture left at all. And then next winter, they'd have to start all over, somehow acquiring new furniture, only to burn it again when the firewood ran out. But burning furniture created its own problems. First, it meant you had nowhere to sit, nowhere to sleep properly, nowhere to eat. Your quality of life, already terrible, got even worse. Second, furniture would often didn't burn very well. It might be painted or treated with oils, and burning these could produce toxic fumes. Third, once you'd burned all your furniture, what then? You were no better off, just more desperate. Some people moved on to burning structural elements of their houses. They'd pull boards off the walls, creating gaps that let in the cold wind. They'd remove floorboards, making their floors dangerous and uneven. In extreme cases, they'd even burn the roof beams, which could cause the roof to collapse. People actually died when their roofs fell on them after they'd burned the supporting beams. This practice of burning parts of your house seems insane, right? You're destroying your shelter to stay warm, making your house worse at keeping you warm. But in the moment, when you're freezing right now, the long-term consequences don't matter. You need heat now, this moment, and you'll deal with the problems you're creating later. If you survive to later. Another desperate tactic was sealing rooms with mud and dung. If you lived in a house with multiple rooms, which most people didn't, but if you did, you might seal off all but one room to make a smaller space that was easier to heat. You'd pack mud, clay, and animal dung into every crack and crevice of that one room, trying to make it as airtight as possible. Dung was actually a good insulator and sealant when mixed with mud. It dried hard and kept out drafts. But it also meant your room was lined with dried feces. The smell was bad, even by medieval standards. And remember what we discussed about air quality? Sealing a room made the air quality even worse. The carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide had nowhere to go. You were creating a more effective death trap. Some desperate people would plaster mud and dung over their entire bodies, especially their children, creating a kind of insulating layer. This might have provided some protection from the cold, but it was also incredibly uncomfortable, and if it got wet, it would actually make you colder. Plus, you'd be covered in feces, which increased the risk of infection if you had any cuts or sores. Then there was the practice of drinking alcohol to stay warm. This seems logical if you don't understand how the body works. Alcohol makes you feel warm. When you drink it, you get a warm, flushed feeling. Blood rushes to your skin, making you feel hot. This feels like it's helping, but it's actually killing you. What's happening is that alcohol causes your blood vessels to dilate, bringing warm blood to your skin surface. This feels good, but it means you're losing heat faster. Your core temperature is actually dropping. You're radiating heat away from your vital organs. People who drank heavily to stay warm would feel great for a while. Then they'd pass out from the alcohol, and they'd freeze to death because their body couldn't maintain its core temperature. Medieval people didn't understand this. They just knew that drinking made you feel warmer, so people would drink as much as they could get their hands on. Ale, mead, wine, whatever was available. They'd drink themselves into stupors, and some of them would never wake up. Families would find them frozen in the morning, looking peaceful, having died thinking they were warm. Desperate trips to gather firewood in blizzards killed many people. When your fire was dying and you had no wood left, you'd have no choice but to go outside and search for more. Even if there was a blizzard, even if the visibility was zero, even if the temperature was lethally cold, because staying inside without fire meant certain death, while going outside meant possible death. Possible was better than certain. People would wrap themselves in whatever they had and venture out into the storm. Many of them got lost within yards of their homes. They'd become disoriented in the blowing snow, unable to see, unable to tell which direction they were going. They'd wander in circles until they collapsed from exhaustion and cold. Their frozen bodies would be found later, sometimes just a few feet from their door, so close to safety but unable to find it. Others would make it further, searching desperately for fallen branches or dead trees. They'd be so focused on finding wood that they wouldn't notice how cold they were getting, wouldn't notice the frostbite setting in. They'd finally find some wood, gather it up, and then realize they were too weak from cold to carry it home. They'd die right there, next to the wood they'd tried so hard to gather. Some people did make it back with wood, but with severe frostbite or hypothermia. They'd stagger through the door with their precious bundle of sticks, and then collapse. Maybe they'd survive, maybe they wouldn't. But they'd given their family a few more hours of heat, and sometimes that was enough to keep the family alive until the weather improved. The competition for firewood could get violent. Forests near villages would be stripped bare early in winter. People would have to go further and further to find wood, which was more dangerous. And when two people found the same fallen tree, fights would break out. There are records of people killing each other over firewood. Not robbing and then killing, but literally fighting to the death over a pile of branches. In some areas, laws prohibited peasants from gathering wood from the Lord's forest. But desperate people would break these laws, sneaking into forbidden areas to steal wood. If they were caught, they could be punished severely, maybe even executed. But when the choice is between maybe being caught and definitely freezing to death, you take the risk. Some people tried to steal firewood from neighbors. They'd wait until a neighbor was asleep or away, then sneak over and take wood from their supply. This caused enormous resentment and conflict within communities. Neighbors who had relied on each other for survival would become enemies over stolen wood. Trust broke down. The social fabric of communities was damaged by the desperation winter created. There are accounts of elderly people voluntarily walking out into the snow to die when food and fuel ran too low. They'd tell their families they were going to gather wood or check on something, and then they'd just walk away. They'd find a quiet spot, sit down, and let the cold take them. This was their final gift to their family, one less mouth to feed, one less body to keep warm. Their sacrifice might mean their grandchildren survived. This practice was probably more common than records suggest because families wouldn't want to admit it happened. It was shameful, even though it was also noble in its own tragic way. But imagine being elderly, knowing you're a burden, knowing your presence might mean your grandchildren starve or freeze. The emotional pain of making that choice must have been enormous. Some people ate things that were dangerous in hopes of surviving just a little longer. They'd eat moldy grain that should have been thrown out. The mold could be toxic, could make you sick, but you'd eat it anyway because it was calories. They'd eat meat from animals that had died of disease, knowing it might poison them. But starvation was a certainty, and poisoning was only a possibility. They'd make soup from bones they'd already boiled multiple times, bones with no nutrition left in them. The soup would be basically hot water with a vague flavor, providing no calories, but the warmth in your stomach felt good. They'd eat bark from trees, leather from shoes and belts, anything to create the sensation of fullness, even though these things provided no nutrition. Children would be sent out to forage even in the middle of winter, searching under the snow for anything edible. Frozen berries, roots, dead grass that animals might eat. The children's smaller bodies meant they got cold faster, and their smaller frames meant they had fewer caloric reserves. Many children died while out foraging, their frozen bodies found later when the snow melted. There are dark hints in historical records of even worse things happening in the most extreme situations. Cannibalism. During the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, there are multiple documented cases of people eating corpses. Some were dead already, some weren't. The records are vague and horrified, but they exist. When your children are starving to death in front of you, when you've eaten everything else, the unthinkable becomes thinkable. Most people didn't go this far. Most people endured the starvation, the cold, the suffering, and either survived or died without resorting to the ultimate taboo. But the fact that it happened at all, that some people were pushed to this extreme, tells you how desperate winter survival was. Medieval people would also engage in what we might call magical thinking or desperate superstition. They'd perform rituals they believed would make the winter end sooner or make them warmer. They'd pray constantly, begging God for mercy, for spring to come early, for the cold to ease. They'd make promises, vow to be better people, offer what little they had to the church if only they could survive. Some would wear amulets or charms they believed protected against cold. They'd recite prayers or spells they thought had power. None of this worked, of course, but it gave them something to do, some sense of control in a situation where they had none. The psychological comfort of believing you were doing something, even if it was useless, was valuable in itself. Communities would sometimes hold processions or ceremonies, carrying holy relics through the village, praying together for deliverance. Everyone would gather, sharing their suffering, creating a sense of unity. These weren't practical survival tactics, but they were social and psychological survival tactics. They helped people endure by reminding them they weren't alone. But ultimately, no amount of prayer or ritual changed the basic reality. Winter was brutal. Survival required warmth and food. Without these, you died. The desperate tactics people employed were attempts to find warmth and food when the normal methods had failed. Some tactics worked, at least temporarily. Others made things worse. And some were just the flailing of desperate people who knew they were probably going to die, but couldn't give up without trying everything possible. The fact that anyone survived using these desperate measures is remarkable. The human drive to survive, to keep going even when everything seems hopeless, is one of our species' most powerful traits. Medieval people demonstrated this trait winter after winter, finding ways to stay alive against odds that should have killed them. Their desperation was tragic, but their determination was inspiring. So here we are at the end of our journey through the brutal reality of medieval winter. We've talked about primitive fires that filled houses with smoke and poison. We've talked about beds that were barely warm enough to keep you alive. We've talked about wearing all your clothes until they rotted on your body. We've talked about living with animals in desperate attempts to share their heat. We've talked about air so toxic it destroyed your lungs. We've talked about food frozen so hard you couldn't eat it, and water you had to melt from ice. We've talked about frostbite claiming fingers and toes, about hypothermia taking lives in the night. We've talked about desperate people burning their furniture, drinking themselves to death, fighting over firewood. Now I want you to look around the room you're in right now. You're warm, aren't you? Maybe you're comfortable. Maybe you're even a little too warm and thinking about turning down the thermostat. Think about that for a moment. You have a thermostat, a device on your wall that lets you control the temperature of your entire house with the touch of a button. You can make it warmer. You can make it cooler. You can set it to automatically maintain exactly the temperature you want, day and night, without you having to do anything at all. This is magic. This would have been literal magic to medieval people. The idea that you could control the weather inside your house, that you could make it warm without fire, without smoke, without danger, without constant work, would have seemed like something only God could do. And yet here we are, doing it every day, and most of us never even think about it. Central heating is one of the most significant technological achievements in human history, and we've completely forgotten that it's a miracle. We turn it on in the fall, we turn it off in the spring, and we never appreciate what we have. We complain when our house is a few degrees too cold. We grumble about heating bills. We take it completely for granted that we'll be warm all winter, every winter, without having to do anything to make that happen. Let me put this in perspective. Every single medieval person who died from cold, and we're talking about millions of people over the centuries, every single one of them would have survived if they'd had access to the heating technology we use today. A simple space heater, the kind you can buy for $30 at any store, would have saved countless lives. A basic furnace, the kind that's in almost every modern house, would have eliminated winter as a deadly threat. The gap between medieval winter survival and modern winter comfort is almost incomprehensible. Medieval people spent 4 to 6 months every year in what we would consider an active survival situation. Imagine being in survival mode for half the year, every year, your entire life. We go camping for a weekend and think we're roughing it. They lived like that for months, and they had no choice, no escape, no relief. Every morning when we wake up in a heated house, we're experiencing something that medieval people would have literally given years of their life for. The feeling of being warm and comfortable when it's freezing outside, the ability to walk around in light clothes inside your house in the middle of winter, the luxury of taking a hot shower. These are experiences so far beyond what medieval people could imagine that they couldn't even dream of them. We have electric blankets. We have heated mattress pads. We have heated car seats. We have portable heaters we can carry from room to room. We have programmable thermostats that heat our homes before we even wake up. We have heat we don't even notice because it's so constant and reliable. Medieval people had fire, smoke, and death. Think about how different your life would be without modern heating. Really think about it. No more lounging around in comfortable clothes inside your house in winter. You'd be wearing every piece of clothing you owned, all the time, slowly rotting in your own sweat and filth. No more getting up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom without bundling up first. No more standing in front of the refrigerator deciding what to eat. Food would be frozen solid and you'd need to use precious fuel to thaw it. You couldn't take a hot shower. You couldn't wash your clothes regularly. You couldn't maintain any standard of hygiene. You'd be itchy all the time from parasites. You'd be coughing from smoke. You'd be scared all the time that your heat source would fail and you'd die. You'd watch people you love suffer and die, and there'd be nothing you could do about it. This was normal life for most of human history. Comfortable winters, warm winters, safe winters, these are a recent innovation. Your grandparents or great-grandparents might remember houses without central heating. My point is that we're only a generation or two removed from people who understood how precious heat is. But we've forgotten. We've become so accustomed to comfort that we think it's our birthright. We think we deserve to be warm. And maybe we do deserve it, but we definitely didn't earn it. We did nothing to create this technology. We were just lucky enough to be born in a time and place where it exists. Medieval people worked harder than we can imagine just to survive, and they still froze. We do almost nothing, and we're perfectly comfortable. The energy we use for heating is astonishing when you really think about it. The average American home uses about 40,000 kilowatt hours of energy for heating each year. That's equivalent to burning about 4 tons of wood. For tons. Medieval families couldn't gather, transport, and store 4 tons of wood. They might have access to a fraction of that. And what they did have, they had to burn carefully, constantly tending it, breathing its smoke, living in fear that it would go out. We use 4 tons worth of energy, and we don't even notice. We pay a utility bill, we might grumble about the cost, but we're not doing the physical labor. We're not breathing the smoke. We're not risking carbon monoxide poisoning. We're not watching our children freeze to death. We're just warm, effortlessly warm, and we think that's normal. This is why I wanted to take you on this journey through medieval winter. Not to make you feel guilty, though maybe a little guilt isn't bad, but mainly to make you aware, to make you appreciate what you have, to make you understand that the comfort you experience every single day is built on centuries of technological advancement, and it's something our ancestors would have considered paradise. The next time you adjust your thermostat, take just a moment to think about what you're doing. You're controlling your environment in a way that would have seemed godlike to medieval people. You have power over winter itself. You've defeated the cold that killed millions. You've won a war that humanity fought for thousands of years. And you did it by pressing a button. Medieval people didn't survive winter. Let me be clear about that. They endured winter. There's a huge difference. Surviving implies you came through relatively okay. Enduring means you suffered terribly, but somehow made it to the other side. Damaged and traumatized, but alive. Most medieval people who lived through winter were physically and psychologically scarred by the experience. They lost fingers and toes to frostbite. Their lungs were damaged by smoke. Their bodies were weakened by malnutrition. Their minds were haunted by the deaths they'd witnessed. And they had to do it all again next year. And the year after that. Every single year of their lives, knowing that any winter might be the one that killed them. We don't endure winter. We barely notice it. We might have to scrape ice off our windshield. We might have to wear a coat. These are minor inconveniences. We complain about them, but they're nothing. They're absolutely nothing compared to what medieval people faced. I want you to feel gratitude, not in an abstract way, but in a real, visceral way. Tonight, when you go to bed in your heated house, when you climb into your comfortable bed with your modern mattress and clean sheets, when you set your programmable thermostat to keep you warm all night while you sleep peacefully, I want you to remember the medieval families huddled together in their curtained beds, wearing all their clothes, shivering despite the shared body heat, never quite warm enough, always worried that someone might not wake up in the morning. Remember the parents who had to make impossible choices about who got to eat. Remember the children who lost fingers and toes. Remember the elderly who walked into the snow to die so their families would have enough food. Remember the desperate people burning their furniture, the sick people dying from cold-related illnesses, the frozen bodies that couldn't be buried until spring. Remember all of this, and then be thankful. Be so incredibly thankful that you were born in this time, in this place, with this technology. You won the lottery. You were born into a world where winter can't kill you, where being warm is easy, where you never have to experience what your medieval ancestors experienced every single year. And maybe, if you're feeling generous, use some of that gratitude to help people who don't have what you have. Because believe it or not, there are still people in the world today who face winter without adequate heating. Homeless people sleeping in the cold. Poor families who can't afford to heat their homes properly. Elderly people living in substandard housing. Refugees in camps without proper shelter. Winter still kills people today. Not as many as it killed in medieval times, but it still kills. And every person who freezes to death in our modern world is a tragedy because we have the technology to prevent it. We could make sure everyone has access to heat. We just don't. Medieval people had an excuse. They didn't have the technology. They couldn't defeat winter no matter how hard they tried. We have no excuse. We have the technology. We have the resources. We just have to decide that everyone deserves to be warm. But that's a bigger conversation for another time. For now, I'll leave you with this final thought. You are living in the most comfortable era in human history. You are living in a time that medieval people couldn't even imagine, where winter is a season to enjoy rather than a season to fear. Where you can go outside and play in the snow and then come inside to a warm house. Where you can appreciate the beauty of winter without experiencing its brutality. This is a gift, an incredible gift. And like all gifts, it should be appreciated. It should be valued. It should never be taken for granted. So the next time you turn on your heat, the next time you adjust your thermostat, the next time you complain that your house is a little too cold, remember the medieval families who would have given anything, absolutely anything, for the warmth you have access to with the press of a button. Remember their suffering. Honor their memory by appreciating what you have. Be grateful that you live now and not then. Because medieval winters were brutal. They were deadly. They were horrific. And thanks to modern technology, thanks to innovations in heating and insulation and energy, you will never have to experience what they experienced. You will never have to endure what they endured. You will never have to face winter the way they faced it. And that, more than almost anything else in modern life, is something worth being truly, deeply grateful for. Stay warm, my friends, and never forget how lucky you are to be able to do so.